Right. So is that all shared now?
You could, yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So my thesis is called Anti-Human Attitude in Science Fiction. The first 2 decades of the 21st century have been tumultuous, to say the least, with terrorism, financial collapses, unpopular wars, public health crises, the rise of populism and the alt-right, and environmental and ecological collapse. This political, cultural, and environmental turbulence has created a significant degree of skepticism towards the human, its place on this planet, and its future, leading to what I am calling an anti-human attitude. This attitude is present throughout our culture, including cinema, in which it is most visible in science fiction. My thesis examines how this anti-human attitude manifests in science fiction films of the 21st century, and how these films reflect concerns and anxieties surrounding technological ubiquity, the human's relation to the non-human, and the possibility of imminent extinction. Though I am arguing that this anti-human attitude has emerged in the past 20 years, I am not arguing that an anti-human attitude is unique to the 21st century. So while science fiction cinema is often a utopian genre, many science fiction films of the 20th century evince a skepticism towards the human. However, utilizing Frederick Jameson's theory of the political unconscious, I claim that anti-human attitudes occupied the underside of the genre in the 20th century, and that any contradictions between this anti-human underside and the humanist surface were resolved or diffused by appeals to uncontrollable and invisible forces, such as history in Planet of the Apes, entropy in Blade Runner, and the human essence in RoboCop. To explain how anti-human attitudes have increasingly overwhelmed this humanist surface in the 21st century, I turn to Raymond Williams' Structures of Feeling. The humanist surface of the genre represents Williams' dominant social character, which is being increasingly challenged by an alternative anti-human social character, which has been spurred on by the strife of the past 2 decades, and has allowed the anti-human attitude to rise up from the political unconscious. I examine how these anti-human attitudes are expressed in 21st century science fiction cinema through textual analyses of key films, focusing on the representation of human and non-human protagonists, tensions between visuals and narratives, and engagements with the alternative humanisms of transhumanism, posthumanism, and anti-humanism. Transhumanism is an ideological movement which can largely be considered an extension of Enlightenment humanism. It posits that the human is the pinnacle of biological evolution, and can and should surpass biological evolution by merging with. The critics of transhumanism point out that the movement is naively utopian, ignoring the social, political, and economic ramifications of its goals. And humanism often plays a vein of anti-humanism, dismissing human subjectivity as inferior to that of its proposed its proposed technological successors. Science fiction most often deals with these issues of transhumanism through the figure of the cyborg. 20th century cyborg films often presented humanist narratives in which a unique human essence was victorious over the dehumanizing effects of technology. In the 21st century, this dominant surface has been challenged by an alternative anti-human attitude. Narratives are still often humanist, but the visuals of 21st century cyborg human ramifications of transhumanism. This thesis utilizes the Marxist theory of reification, especially as formulated by Georg Lukács, to examine how technological augmentation undermines human subjectivity by transforming the cyborg protagonists of recent transhumanist films into commodities. Two films are focused on as case studies. In the 2014 remake of RoboCop, the protagonist Murphy is branded a commodity by his robotic body, and his human subjectivity is subverted by corporate-owned software. In the 2017 remake of Ghost in the Shell, digital effects, which can themselves be considered commodities, are used non-diegetically in the creation of the protagonist's entirely synthetic body, and consistently associate her with the diegetic digital commodities that populate the film. Both these films feature humanist narratives in which their human protagonists gain dominance over their technological augmentations. However, images of reification and conclusions which continue to visually code them as commodities suggest that the dominant humanist character of the genre can no longer repress an anti-human attitude. Having perceived this attitude in transhumanist science fiction films, my thesis moves on to post-human films. Posthumanism is generally acknowledged as an alternative to Enlightenment humanism, which seeks to redefine the human along gender, sexual, racial, and non-human lines. In science fiction, the most common representative of posthumanism is the non-human, and the genre's various animals, robots, and extraterrestrials provide a counter to traditional. In the science fiction of the 20th century, these entities were often merely symbols for some aspect of the human subject. In 21st century science fiction films, non-human characters are beings in their own right, and are often juxtaposed against unsympathetic human characters. So my thesis engages with Jacques Derrida's theories of the supplement and difference with an A, to argue that while in science fiction films of the past century, the non-human was supplementary to the human, in this century science fiction cinema, the relationship is reversed, and the non-human is constituted by the human. Ex Machina and District 9 are used as case studies. In Ex Machina, instead of the two human protagonists being constituted through their relationship with the robotic Ava, the robot's personality is constituted through the two humans. Further in the film, Ava moves beyond her reliance on the human characters, and the human subject is dismissed. In District 9, human characters are compared unfavorably to the film's alien protagonists. The aliens are rendered entirely with digital effects, which allows for the creation of sympathetic, non-human characters who can be effectively juxtaposed against unsympathetic human characters. Unlike in transhumanist films, the dominant character of posthumanist films of the 21st century is unable to repress the anti-human alternative character, resulting in films which are explicitly dismissive of the human subject. So while posthumanist films dismiss the human, anti-human science fiction films go further, depicting the annihilation of humanity. Anti-humanism is most commonly referred to as a school of French philosophy developed in the 1960s, which sought to decenter the human. Based on pronouncements of the end of the human, such as that made by Michel Foucault, there is a more general anti-humanism, one which identifies the human species as a harmful force on this planet, and which perceives issues such as anthropogenic climate change and the rise of populism and the alt-right as evidence that Homo sapiens deserve to go extinct. Engaging with this concept of anti-humanism and with Slavoj Žižek's theory of how the spectacle of the real inculcates audiences to the possibility of human annihilation. This thesis argues that a number of 21st century science fiction films are explicitly anti-human, presenting apocalyptic scenarios and human extinction as desirable and deserved. Much like transhumanist films of the past 20 years, some of these anti-human films feature humanist narratives which are unable to resolve the contradictions produced by their anti-human visuals. The Matrix trilogy, released in the early years of the 21st century, fails to address the concerns raised by its anti-human visuals, in which the human species is coded as a pest or a disease. Much more recently, War for the Planet of the Apes presents an explicitly anti-human narrative, which is reinforced by images of humans inspired by white supremacy and the alt-right. In conclusion, though science fiction cinema of the 21st century still often continues the genre's humanist narrative tradition, the events of the first two turbulent decades of this century have allowed an anti-human attitude to rise from the political unconscious. This attitude troubles the humanist narratives of transhuman films, dismisses the human in favour of the non-human, and even puts a positive spin on images of human extinction. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you. Okay, we'll go back to the main screen with you on it. If you stop sharing, and time for questions.
Okay, I'll go ahead and get started. I never really come up with questions. It's more like observations. So I like sci-fi, but I would say I like particular genres. Not genres. I like particular scenarios, but they would dive into like dramas or whatever as well. I really have been into post-apocalyptic anything lately, and so it's not necessarily movies I've been watching. It's been a lot of TV shows on Netflix and Prime as well. And so I think that your theory kind of extends into other genres as well because of this. I think there's a lot of anti-humanism stuff going on beyond the science fiction realm. But then again, I guess it depends on how you define science fiction. But I just got done watching this show called To the Lake. It's actually a Russian TV show that they dubbed English over it. So with your research, is it primarily just like American movies that you're looking into, or are you looking at more of like a universal kind of thing?
Because science fiction is such a broad genre, I've limited myself to English language science fiction films.
Okay.
Because otherwise, as you say, it could be or Russian or. And the problem I think with doing that is I would have to take into account the kind of cultural concerns attendant to like Japanese cinema, which are like beyond the scope of my research.
Yeah, it seems like it'd be a lot of work.
Chris, I had a couple of questions, if I could. You started off, you were talking about the 21st century aspect of this, you know, unpopular wars, financial crises, etc., etc. So it sounds like that's pivotal. So haven't there always been these things though? Haven't there always been recessions? Haven't there always been unpopular wars? Hasn't there always been terrorism? So what is so unique about the 21st century in that regard?
it's that all of these things have happened within this very this comparatively short period of time. There's also the idea that there was all these anxieties surrounding the turn of the millennium, and those anxieties seem to have continued on beyond the turn of the millennium.
Yeah.
Almost as if these kind of, I suppose, like apocalyptic concerns were then like heightened by all this turmoil that happened over the last 20 years. Yeah. So you're right that these things have always existed. But I think this is things existing in a very, very short space of time, leading to this very leading to a great deal of anxiety surrounding this century.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was also wondering, when you were talking about post-humanism and you were talking about the films with non-humans that supplement the human characters, how would something like the Terminator series fit into that, if indeed it does? It seems like in those films you have Schwarzenegger's cyborg supplements the human. So is that relevant? Well, I'm not sure if I understood fully. But
I suppose it is, because the films that tend to get labelled post-human are the ones in which the non-humans are, if not sympathetic, they're not the outright villains. So, like, so Blade Runner is often referenced as a post-human film because the replicants are not necessarily the heroes of the film, but they're not the villains. They have like some kind of like symbolic worth for what. The Terminator films, this is the idea of technology being directly opposed to humanity. So in that sense, it's not. I suppose in that sense it would be the supplement, but it would be. Derrida also notes that the supplement can replace what it supplements. So I suppose in the Terminator films it goes that way with the robots trying to get rid of humans.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Chris, this is sort of to run on the back of Madison's question. I mean, you're not just focused on American sci-fi, is that right? So you're looking at the English-speaking world. And are you noticing any differences across the English-speaking world? Is the mise en scène different? You know, is there sci-fi coming out of Australia, you know, Britain, America, whatever, you know? Are you noticing something different there?
I think so. The two films I'm looking at in the post-human segment, Ex Machina and District 9. Ex Machina is a British film, and District 9 is a South African film. And I think they both have different, like very different tones and styles to the American films I'm looking at.
But is that film specific, or can you make some sort of statement about films coming out of each of these countries?
I think you could, although that's kind of like not what I'm looking at. That's like beyond what I'm looking at. I'm researching like the specific common aspects across these films, as opposed to what makes each nationality distinct.
Okay, so you're not doing any further categorization beyond what is common. I just wonder if that's enough.
But to be honest, I hadn't thought about making any kind of distinctions between films beyond whether I'm looking at the transhuman, post-human, or anti-human.
I guess I'm probably saying, are you going to do a thematic analysis of these films? You know, you're because if you're looking at what's common, you already are looking for a theme, are you not?
I am. I suppose I would. I'd say that I'm looking for a thematic theme, and then the differences come in how each individual film expresses that.
I mean, Chris, you're still in your early stages, aren't you? Were you full-time or part-time? I've forgotten.
I'm full time.
Full-time. Is this your second year?
Yeah, just started my second year. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is kind of a big year for getting all of that data, if you will, together. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Could I ask one more question, Chris?
Yeah.
Please.
It's interesting that you mentioned the RoboCop remake and one of the Planet of the Apes, the newer films. So, to what extent you're dealing with films that are part of pre-existing franchises that span decades in some cases? So, are you observing quite a shift then in terms of their attitudes that you're looking at from, say, the old Planet of the Apes films to these newer iterations?
I am, yeah. I mentioned looking at how the 20th century films kind of like appeal to these uncontrollable forces. To take Planet of the Apes as an example, in the original, there's a lot to suggest that that what happens to the Earth and what happens to the human species is a result of like the inevitable force of history. Like, while in the newer films, it's represented much more as the result of human action.
Yeah, thank you.
And Chris, what makes us human and what makes us not human?
That's a very big question. For because I'm talking about, in some senses, I'm talking about an actual like a human subject. And other in other senses, I'm talking about human as a biological species. I have had to make a distinction between those two sometimes. I've not delved too much in what makes the human subject human, although looking at the transhuman element, there's a great deal of focus on cognition and reasoning. And these films often use images of like of eyes and like of eyes and like first person perspectives, and the use of memory a great deal as well to define the human against technology. So in terms of what I'm looking at, the human is largely an autonomous subject with its own unique perspective and memories.
And what I think I missed, what time period are you examining in these films?
This is this is the 21st century, so the past 20 years.
So, but presumably, maybe in your literature review, you've looked at the evolution of the science fiction film.
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
Have you been able to go back to what the very first science fiction film was?
I mean, there's some debate as to what the first science fiction film was, because there's a lot of debate around what science fiction is. So some people would say it was Georges Méliès's Trip to the Moon, although some others might say it was Metropolis. It depends on who you speak to.
Yes, so the symbolist, the minimalist symbolist, symbolism, all of that movement. Yeah, very interesting, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think time has beaten us, but thank you ever so much, Chris.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Oh, pleasure. I think I would like to see that we can make this group grow. It's